Alrighty, so welcome to the Northern Community of Practice Soil Carbon Workshop. Thanks very much for joining us, and I'd like to welcome Susan Orgel, who will be giving us a rundown on soil carbon and how we can manage it and understand it for improved soil performance and plant performance. Like I said, I'm recording. Let's make this interactive and relax. Please use the chat box. I'll be typing a few bits and pieces in the chat so that you can follow along. If you've got any questions or comments you'd like to make, just tap away. And at the end of this webinar, I'll just hang on at the end. So if you guys have got any questions of me or any comments you'd like to make, or if you'd like to jot down some things that are posted in the chat, feel free. But also I will send you the link to the recording so that you can have a look at what's written in the chat and catch up if you need to. I don't probably have much else to say, but yeah, take some notes and play along at home, and I'll pass it over to what I might actually do is, yesterday we had a bit of a run through of what everyone was up to, so Sue's found that quite useful. So perhaps just a couple of minutes each, just to let Suze know a bit of your background, and particularly in regards to soil carbon. So what is it about, what bits of soil carbon is involved in your projects, or if you've got any soil carbon projects, and what are some of your issues that you'd like to let Susan know about. So Anne, would you like to kick off for us?
Thank you, Felicity. Susan, Anne Cooch. I work as a Regional Agricultural Land Care Facilitator for Northern Slopes Land Care based at Moree, covering the northern part of the Northwest Local Land Services region. I work closely with George, who's on the team with us. He's in the ag team at LLS at Gunnedah. Carbon, for me, I suppose I became very much aware of carbon probably in the early 2000s when I came across Dr. Christine Jones for the first time. And then it started to think about, the carbon trading options. I did the Carbon 101 course back in those times. But my whole focus has actually been on building carbon in soils generally, wherever you are, to build the health of the soil. And I've always treated trading as a secondary, as a bonus to actually getting soil health, because you're going to make massive improvements in your productivity, whether it's livestock or cropping, regardless of the trading option, but that then becomes a bonus to you if you can get your carbon levels up. So it's a matter of understanding that, how we keep them up, and how we can enhance, I guess, the retention of carbon in the soil over time, I suppose, would be really key for us, in a cropping and a mixed farming environment. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. George, would you like to follow on with that, if you have anything to add to what Anne has said in your area?
No, thanks, Felicity. Yeah, so Susan, I'm the Mixed Farming Extension Officer with LLS Northwest at Gunnedah. I guess interest in the carbon is, I'm mainly involved with pasture work, so it's about increasing ground cover and building up that carbon in the soil, as Anne's alluded to. But I guess I have a fairly basic understanding. So yeah, very I'm keen to hear and learn in terms of carbon. Thanks, Felicity.
Thanks, George. Cole, could you unmute yourself and let us know the chat?
Yes. Does the sound come through when I've got headphones on?
Cole, we can't hear you very well. I'm not sure if your microphone's turned on.
Headphones, is that any better?
A little bit. Can you hear okay, Suze?
Oh, now I've lost volume with you. Can you hear with if I take the headphones off?
Yeah, that's better. Yep, I can hear better.
Ah, good. Hi, Suze. My story's a bit like George and Anne's. I'm in the Hunter, local land services, sustainable ag there. So like George and Anne, working with pastures a bit. The particular interest I guess I have currently with carbon is that we're trialling the soil key implement from Victoria. and seeing how that goes locally. In Victoria, it's been used primarily as a tool for the winter feed gap and a multi-species oversowing. We're trying that here with the multi-species. We're also trialling it on extensive pastures and looking to see whether it's a useful tool for pasture renovation. We've got AgriProve, who are one of those companies that organise carbon credits, doing the soil cores for the carbon with the CFI methodology. It's not a big part of our focus in the project. We're particularly interested in growing more feed, but we are looking at the feasibility of using that tool to increase carbon, with perhaps the potential of turning it into a carbon credit.
Great. Just a quick question on that. Is that the trial where Aaron Simmons is also taking some independent samples?
Potentially, yes.
Yep, cool. Yep, no, I know the one.
He says he's going to be there, but I haven't seen him yet.
Yeah, right. All right, chase him up. Awesome. All right, I know the one.
Excellent. Thanks, Cole. That was a great introduction. Tim, would you like to go next?
How you going? I'm Tim Barter. I'm an agronomist with Central West Local Land Services, and I do the cropping extension here. And so I do, primarily my involvement with soil carbon. We do a few different workshops on extending basic soil understanding to farmers and some agronomists in the region from time to time, but we also do a fair few different cropping trials and that sort of thing. So my interest is kind of how do we use carbon and improve carbon to enable our continued productivity of our country, so that we're still getting good yielding crops while also looking after our soil, because we have a number of really good heavy country as well as really light sandy soupy country.
Thanks, Tim. Richard, it'd be nice and warm up there, I imagine.
Oh, it's cool. We got down to 11 degrees last night, so for us that's cool. Oh yeah, I still got my coat on too. Okay, Richard Hobbs. I'm an extension agronomist with HCPSL here in Ingham, North Queensland. My main focus on carbon has been mainly on the labile carbon that we're getting from our mixed species legumes, and that trying to give us an increase there. And that, up here in the wet tropics, we find it very hard to try and apart from that there, it's the SRA project that's driving us up here on our soil carbons and other nutrients.
I missed the middle bit, but I assume you said that you find it hard to maintain high labile carbon because of the climate, because things turn over quite rapidly.
Yeah. And that that's one of our problems. And that although we're in a wet tropics, we're in a unique situation. We have a lot of green cane trash blanket, which means we're putting a lot of cane trash back onto our soils, and that there does help us. But we've been doing that now for 30 plus years, and basically haven't increased our carbon at all. And that we get a bit of labile carbon, but that burns off within a season.
Yep.
Thanks, Richard. Kel.
G'day, Susan. Long time no see. I work for North Coast LS in the SUS Ag team, basically managing externally funded projects. Really, that's my role. We do have more technical people in beef pastures and dairy, but I mainly manage projects where we've received external funds. So we have a couple on the go at the moment, which the rest of the team's probably heard me talk about to death. One's a compost demonstration project funded by EPA. So we're doing some demonstration work to see what different rates of compost we'll do on grazing pastures, overlaid with a rotational grazing system across 4 different farms. There's a component of that we are doing soils and pasture monitoring, but not specifically for carbon, but it is one of the things that we will measure as we go along. The second one is a Catchment Action New South Wales funded project where and Lucas is across this one a little bit too, where we've set up 100 hectares of rotational grazing with a beef producer. So we're going to measure the change in practice, soil measurements, pasture measurements, do all the economics on that 100 hectares. And again, soil carbon will be part of that. Early on, there was talk about trying to figure out whether we could fit that property into some sort of carbon market process. But it got a little bit tricky and all seemed a little bit too difficult to fit it into the boxes for the North Coast. So we might do an audit in terms of its carbon emissions and try and work it out that way, but I don't know how it will fit in terms of the fitting into the carbon market as you go forward within this part of the state. Yeah, I don't know if Lucas wants to add anything to that, but that's kind of where we're at with that project at the moment. Just set up the fencing last week, I think, from what they told me, so it should start early in July.
Yeah, I like your approach, Kel. The other stuff could be a can of worms, I think, at this stage.
Yeah, so again, I'm pretty pragmatic. It's a bit like Anne, let's work out the best practices and try and focus on getting that right and do the measurements and see where things go, rather than trying to be too focused on a single facet of soil management, I guess. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Cal. Thanks, everybody. There you go, Susan. That gives you a bit of background about where we're all from and some of the challenges we face. So I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much.
It does. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, perfectly.
Yep. Sorry, just wait. Give it a little bit of time to load up with the presentation. Thanks, everyone, for that introduction. It's really useful and interesting, and I guess I greatly value everyone's focus on both building soil health but also supporting sustainable production, because there's no use in building, I guess, our natural resource base if we can't continue to use that into the future as well. And that's where a lot of our work is looking at functional carbon. So most definitely building soil health, but making sure that we're managing those processes which make nutrients available and soil structure enhanced through organic matter accumulation and use as well. So thanks for the invitation to come along and chat today. Just a little bit of background on me. I'm a researcher based at the Wagga Wagga Ag Institute. I've been with DPI for 15 years now, kind of knew Kel when I first started with DPI, working on one of the Murrumbidgee CMA projects back in the day, and where we ran some really successful soil health workshops where we'd talk about soil testing and the importance, and there was subsidised soil tests, and we had a great recipe for growing crops and pastures where we'd go, right, you need this much NPKs and this is what you need to do to, you've got your nutrients, you've got your soil, it's going to rain, it's probably not because it's a drought, and you know what you're going to grow so you can come up with a good nutrient budget. What I found really interesting in those first 3 years of running those workshops, which were really well attended, were the questions that we'd get around soil biology and soil organic matter. It was like this black box. So we could talk about all the ingredients that you can pour into a soil to grow a plant, but we'd always have these, but what if kind of questions, and what about the role of our soil organisms, and what about the organic matter pool for nutrient provision? So from that kind of led me on a bit of a journey through skipping through a PhD, actually probably dragging myself through my PhD, which looked at farm management strategies to increase soil carbon. I've been fortunate enough to work in the soil carbon space since then. From the introduction of everyone, it seems like there's a varied level of knowledge on soil organic carbon, and knowing that we've got kind of the extreme of having someone like Lucas van Swieten on the line as well, I want to present this first slide as a bit of a journey so that we all come up to the same knowledge level together, because I really think if you understand the flows of carbon around the landscape for your own individual farming systems situations, you can think about what some of the likely practices are to impact soil organic matter cycling and soil carbon accumulation. So we're going to start with talking about the flows of carbon around the landscape. So, and someone mentioned Christine Jones earlier. I think, Anne, you mentioned that. And Christine has a beautiful way of describing, I guess, the liquid carbon pathway. So where we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and through the process of photosynthesis, plants take that carbon dioxide and it goes from a gas, and they combine it with sunlight, using sunlight, they combine it with water and make energy for themselves. And this is the direct way that carbon goes from being a gas in our atmosphere to being liquid carbon in the plant, and solid carbon in those plant structure as well. Once we have that carbon in the plant, it can be either stored above ground, in biomass above ground, or it can go below ground. Approximately 40% of all carbon that's drawn in through this process stays in that above ground pool. So we're talking about leaves and litter, but it also includes manure, and 60% goes below ground. Now, of that 60% that goes below ground, about half of it leaks out of the plant root systems in the form of root exudates. So those carbohydrate-rich materials which draw soil organisms into the rhizosphere to help the plant grow and explore the soil, to cycle nutrients, to mediate temperature and moisture and pH. And that's a really important use of carbon in this, I guess, economy, where the plant trades carbohydrates through its roots for microorganisms to help with that organic matter cycling. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we progress today. We've also obviously got carbon stored up in the root systems, and different plants have different rooting depths and different root morphology, so they're structured differently, so they can put carbon at different places within that soil profile. Once we're in this medium, so once organic matter, be it from leaves and litter on the soil surface and manure to roots and exudates, we're talking about the soil organic matter pool. Organic matter in the soil can be protected when it's wrapped up nice and tightly within soil aggregates, so crumbs of soil. And when we say it's protected to a certain extent from further decomposition. So we might take a soil sample, bring it back to the lab, and we dry it, and we grind it, we sieve it through a 2 mil sieve, and then we can measure it, and we can look at the type of carbon it is. And we might say that it's labile carbon. And I think someone, maybe Cole, mentioned labile carbon in his introduction. So labile carbon is the fresh, readily decomposable carbon. And that's what we might measure back in the lab. But realistically, when we're thinking about it in the soil, it was wrapped up nice and tightly within a soil aggregate. It was in the soil profile, so it was already protected, and say that was under a perennial pasture or under a no-till system. While we might measure it as labile and maybe give it a tag of being turned over within weeks to months, in the field, our studies have shown that this organic matter, which is labile, could actually stay there for a matter of decades, which is really important to think about. So straight away, there's a role for our land management in protecting carbon that's stored within the soil. But we also like our carbon to be, our organic matter to be functional, because it feeds our microorganisms. And as I said before, that's a really important pathway for nutrient provision for our crop and pasture growth. And it also promotes and enhances soil structure as well. So our microbes, as well as our other soil critters, will decompose organic matter. And nearly all of our plant available nutrients need to go through this cycle to become available to plants. So it's certainly something that we need to, I guess, appreciate, and it's a really important use of organic matter. Now, microbes themselves are a type of carbon in soil, so we can measure that through our microbial biomass carbon, and it contributes to the total carbon pool when we look at that in our soil test as well. Humus, which is a form of carbon that you'd be familiar with, is basically dead microbes and microbial products. And so the more microbial action we have, the greater the extent we can build up humus in our soil as well. Now, microbial products can also be stabilized in the soil through either their form, so their nutrient relationships and the nutrient ratios of their form, but also through their association with clay particles as well. So some of our humic and fulvic acids can form really neat bonds with clays, and this is called organomineral associations. And again, this is another way of stabilizing carbon in our soil, which leads to building up carbon within our soils as well. So if we were just to have a look at this system, we could think, okay, if we've got rainfall and if we can grow as much biomass as we possibly can because we've got good tactical agronomy, we're looking at promoting soil cover, we're enhancing soil structure, we've got diverse either rotations or species being planted in our pastures, we're maximising that photosynthetic pathway, which increases the amount of carbon which can go into the soil and can increase the residence time or the build-up of carbon. Now, when this carbon builds up in the soil, as I said, it can be in different fractions. So we have our particulate or our labile carbon, which is kind of like the cash flow. So that's the readily decomposable fraction, which is really important for energy and nutrients for our microorganisms. We have our humic pool, which, as I said before, is those microbial products which build up in the soil, and different cells and parts of microbes which build up into a very important nutrient reservoir because they're very nutrient rich and a very stable form of carbon. And then we also have another stable form of carbon in our soil in terms of, I've called it charcoal here. It's technically called char, but it's very, very fine bits of charcoal that you wouldn't be visible to the naked eye, which occur in our soils to varying extents, but up to 35% in some places have been reported. And this is through patterns of tens of thousands of years of burning across the Australian landscape. So not necessarily accumulating through burning stubble, but we're talking about big burning events which have happened over tens of thousands of years. We also have a carbon loss pathway in this flow as well. So as our microbes decompose organic matter, they respire, just as we kind of, when we're active, we respire as well. Actually, even if you're inactive, you'll respire, hopefully. And plants will respire as well. The other pathway that we have for loss is through erosion. And what this means is that we can have soil organic matter be physically removed from the site. And now it might move to a place in the landscape which makes it more vulnerable to decomposition, or it just might move somewhere and be buried. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go back up into the atmosphere, but it's certainly a loss from that site. And that's certainly something through promotion of ground cover and minimum tillage that we can mediate or reduce. Now that flow of carbon is happening in all of our landscapes. So the picture in the previous slide was a cropping landscape. This is an introduced permanent pasture around Burrawa. That flow of carbon is occurring in this landscape as well. What we can influence is the magnitude and rate of that flow with our land management. Similarly, in this environment here, which is in the rangelands, and this is a Mitchell grass pasture out near Cobar, the same flow is happening. I guess the levers that we can influence are the things that will change. Now, I've used a couple of terms interchangeably, and I just want to touch on a few definitions. So we have soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. When we're talking about soil organic matter, by definition, we're referring to the fraction that's less than 2 millimeters in diameter. So you might recall in the previous slide where I said we take a soil sample, we dry it to 40 degrees, and then we sieve it through a 2 mil fraction sieve. Now, when we're including the greater than 2 mil fraction, gives really highly variable results when we're looking at total carbon results. Also, the less than 2 mil fraction is the fraction that's more closely related to our soil properties. So it gives us a good indication, I guess, of the soil organic matter that can actively influence those soil factors. So that's why we look at less than 2 millimeters. It's also really important for standardizing across labs, so it has a role there as well. Now, once we're looking at the less than 2 mil fraction, it includes partially decomposed organic residues, microbes, humus, charcoal. So it includes all of that. Now, when we look at soil organic carbon, carbon is the measurable component of the soil organic matter pool. So soil organic matter is approximately 58% carbon by weight. Really importantly, the rest of organic matter is made up of all of these plant nutrients, which we're used to talking about in our recipe agronomy. So nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur. So soil organic matter, while it's carbon, it's also a really important nutrient reservoir as well. And there's a range of trace elements which are in that pool also. Now, when you get your soil test results back from the lab, we like to look at, well, first of all, we like it to be a NATA accredited lab. So we like it to be so that they're using standardized procedures. It needs to be on the less than 2 mil fraction, which NATA accredited labs will use. And then we look at the soil organic carbon percentage. Now, some labs will also report soil organic matter content, and that's a calculation. So that's where they'll take your organic carbon percentage and multiply it by a factor, 1.72, to give you organic matter. So let's cut the calculation out for this one, and we just look at soil organic carbon percentage. And this is the total organic carbon that's in the soil. So that includes all those pools that I spoke about. It includes all of those, the char, the humus, and the labile carbon. It might be reported in grams of carbon per 100 grams of soil, and that's the same unit as that can be converted to percentage. Now, something else that we'll talk about throughout this presentation is soil carbon stocks. And this is where we're looking at the tons of carbon per hectare. And typically this is reported to 30 centimetres because that's the international protocol for carbon trading. And that's, I guess, become the adopted standardised way of reporting soil carbon across different soil types and land uses. Now, this is a calculation. So it uses that soil organic carbon concentration that I've just mentioned. It uses the bulk density of the soil and the depth of the soil to give you that tons of carbon per hectare. So we take a concentration, we know what the mass of the soil was and the depth over which that occurred. Another unit that often gets spoken about with soil carbon trading is carbon dioxide equivalence. Now, 1 tonne of soil carbon is equivalent to 3.66 tonnes of carbon dioxide. So this is just a metric unit that we use to compare emissions of greenhouse gases based on their global warming potential. So we bring it all back to carbon dioxide equivalents. But it's really important to think about how you're reporting your carbon results, and it needs to be fit for purpose. So generally it's going to be in concentration or soil organic carbon stocks. So why are we interested in soil organic carbon? And it seems like a silly question to ask a group like this because you've already answered it. It's really important for nutrient cycling. It's important for pasture regeneration. It's important for crop and pasture growth and quality. So there's these immense production benefits. And some of these immense production benefits are directly related to the soil factors that soil organic matter can influence. So increasing your soil organic carbon can increase your cation exchange capacity. So the cation exchange capacity is the soil's ability to hold on to and exchange nutrients. And in particular, what I like to refer to as your EM, so calcium, potassium, sodium, magnesium, aluminium, and they're our main cations that we're talking about. Now, in a clay-rich soil, cation exchange capacity is mainly influenced by 2 things. The amount and type of clay and your soil organic carbon content. Now, in a sandy soil, your soil organic carbon can account for up to 90% of that cation exchange capacity. So it's really important. So it's a real driver of, I guess, nutrient storage. And cation exchange capacity is going to be dependent on soil type and management, soil pH, and also the organic matter type. But when we're thinking about cation exchange capacity, and I used this example yesterday as well, I want you to imagine that we're all sitting in a big room full of people. So we're in a room, and that room is our soil. All the chairs that are laid out is our spaces on our clays to hold on to our EMs, our cations, okay? And all the people sitting on those chairs are our cations, so calcium, magnesium, potassium, aluminium, and sodium, okay? And that's what we've got, that's our soil. Now, what we're talking about is with increasing soil organic carbon is bringing a whole heap more chairs into that room. So now all of a sudden we can have more people sitting down, right? So we can have a greater nutrient storage in our soil. Now, if we look at the flip side of that, if we take away half the chairs that are in the room, now half the people are standing, they're not attached to the soil anymore, they're standing. What happens when it rains? they get leached away. So they're now in soil solution. So they're not actually held within the soil, they're in solution. So the importance of organic carbon is that we can increase the soil's ability to hold on to and exchange nutrients, which is a really important function. It's still important in clay-rich soils, but it's incredibly important in sandier soils. Now, soil organic matter is also a really important nutrient reservoir, and I mentioned that a couple of slides ago. But in general, a 1% increase in soil organic carbon, so going from a carbon percentage of 1 to 2 in the top 10 centimetres, gives you over a ton of extra nitrogen. So that's really important. Straight away, we're talking dollars here. So a ton of nitrogen, 200 and something kilos of phosphorus, 160 something kilos of sulfur. So it's really important in terms of the productivity and benefits of those nutrients as well. So with that soil organic matter comes nutrients, and there can be a value associated with that. And remember what I said before, nearly all of our nutrients need to first pass through soil organisms to become plant available. And this is where organic matter supplies not only nutrients, but the energy for microorganisms to provide that function. Another really important function of soil organisms is through increasing water holding capacity and infiltration as they decompose organic matter. So as soil organisms degrade organic matter, they produce sticky substances which stick particles together and enhance the structural stability of the soil. Fungal hyphae will wrap up soil aggregates, making it so that when it rains, that soil doesn't collapse. It holds together and acts like a sponge for increased water holding capacity. In sandy soils, this is really, in clay soils it's important as well, but particularly in sandy soils, it can have a great effect on the total water holding capacity of those soils. So a 1% increase, if we use the previous example, going from a 1 to 2% soil organic carbon reading can give you up to a third extra capacity to store soil moisture. When we're looking at our fluctuations in climate and the variability that everyone's experiencing, making use of all the rainfall that falls on properties is really important. So when we get a 50 millimetre downpour out at Wagga, making sure that that 50 millimetres goes into the soil and is stored there, again, is so important for productivity. And this is what we call our functional carbon. So it's not just about getting organic matter into the soil and keeping it there, it's also about that carbon economy, because that microbial process of reducing or mineralizing and immobilizing nutrients and enhancing water holding capacity is really important. Now, through these functions, we've also got the provision of off-farm services, so ecosystem services. So there's things like regulating climate, there's things like filtering and recycling water and air and nutrients, and these all have a value for our society as well. There's increasing opportunities, I guess, to diversify farm income through documenting the benefits of improved land management for some of these ecosystem services. So what we're talking about there is collecting the information that demonstrates the public good benefit of on-farm management. And we now have emerging markets, not just the carbon trading ones, but emerging markets where that's going to be valued. So that can be a farm product as well. So when we think about our sequestration potential, we know that our soils vary in their capacity to sequester and protect carbon. If we're looking at just the balance though, our soil organic carbon concentration is dependent on the amount of organic matter going in. So it's either grown in situ or it's grown somewhere else and brought to the site in terms of hay, compost, biosolids, manures. And that's balanced by the carbon loss. And the carbon loss is the respiration from decomposition, so the loss of carbon that way, or from soil erosion, where we've got that physical removal of carbon from the site there. Now that balance is going to be modified by the type of organic matter that goes into the soil. So not only its physical structure, which influences the surface area for microbes and other soil organisms to decompose it, but also the nutrient composition of that, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, but also the soil's capacity to store carbon. So this is dependent on things like the amount of clay, the type of clay, soil depth and soil structure, and they can all modify that flow of carbon that we spoke about on the first slide. Now, some of these factors, or all of these factors, drive productivity. Some of these factors can be changed. So with our land management, we can change the type of plants that we're growing. We can implement practices which enhance and protect soil structure, and some can't easily be changed. So in particular, the clay content and soil depth. If we look at just how much these soil and climate factors can influence carbon sequestration, I just wanted to share this graph with you. So what we're looking at here is on the x-axis, we've got our total organic carbon percentage. It's in grams per 100 grams. Remember, that's just percentage. And on our y-axis, we've got depth descending. So for soil scientists, we like to have the soil surface at the top of the graph, and then it goes down with depth. So it's going from the soil surface at the top down to 70 centimeters. Now, the three graphs that you can see there are for three different soil types in the same region. The first graph, the top one, is for a basalt-derived soil, so a very, very high concentration of high fertility clays. The second graph down in the same region is a shallow granite-derived soil, so this is an extremely sandy soil which is poorly structured and shallow in terms of the soil depth. And the next graph down is a deep granite-derived soil. So it's heavily duplex. We've got a sand over a clay, but you've got a good depth of soil and reasonable clays in the subsoil. Now, what we're looking at, we've got two lines. There's the black line with the solid dots, and then there's the open dots as well. They're different pasture types. So one dominated by native species, the next dominated by introduced species. It actually doesn't matter which is which because there was no difference. Now, the grey shaded line going down, that's the range in those carbon values across 30 sites. Now, as you can see, we've got higher carbon in the top 0 to 10 centimeters, and then it declines with an increase in depth. And you see that often in a lot of our soil profiles, other than when you move out west when it's kind of less of a decline. So there's more carbon in the surface soil, less in the subsoil. Next thing you notice is that those graph shapes are very different, aren't they, depending on soil type. So for the same region, soil type is influencing not only the amount of carbon in the surface soil, but carbon as it goes down the profile as well. Now, in these soils, when we looked at the tons of carbon per hectare, so the carbon stocks, there was twice as much carbon under the same pastures on basalt-derived soils than there was on the deep granite-derived soils, so the fertile granite soils. When we just look at the granite soils, there was twice as much carbon in the fertile granite soils compared with the lighter textured shallow granite soils. So soil type is a major factor in influencing carbon stocks. Now, there's one graph that I had hidden there. If we look at that now, these are deep granite-derived soils. There was 24 in this survey, which is in the bottom graph here, in the Burra region. So it's a similar soil type. You can see already that the carbon profile still declines as you get an increase in depth, but also the carbon concentration was far less in the Burra region, same soil type, different climate, than in the Monero region. So all that was different there, same soil type, all of a sudden now we're thinking about how much rainfall falls and when it falls in the season. So they're the same pasture type. So climate's also going to be really important when you're thinking about sequestration potential. Now, yesterday I got asked a question about changes in soil carbon or the variability within a season and between seasons when we get droughts. So I just wanted to give you this, it's like just a conceptual image of what happens in the fluctuation of soil carbon. So here on the x-axis we have time. It doesn't matter for what I'm going to tell you about. This could be within a season, it could be across various seasons or across decades. And on the y-axis, we've got carbon percentage, so the carbon concentration. So what we'll find with time is that you'll get this bouncing around. So because we know that carbon's influenced by biomass production, biomass production is influenced by rainfall and temperature. And we know that carbon's also influenced by microbial processes, which are also influenced by rainfall and temperature. So we know that this happens. So when we look at the trend over time, if for our example here, if we changed practice and we were monitoring trends through time, we could see that we've got a gradual increase in soil organic carbon. But if we came in and sampled at different points within that, so if we were only going to sample 3 times, for example, we could actually see, maybe think that no, there's a decline, or perhaps it's not increasing as much as we thought it was going to increase. So it's really important to monitor over time. Where you don't have that opportunity, because we don't all have long-term trials, paired sites and controls is a really valuable way in picking up some of that noise as well. Now, another way of picking up some of that noise is looking at our soil organic carbon fractions. So before, remember I said you've got your char, your humus, and your particulate organic carbon. And somebody's already hit the nail on the head and said it's the particulate or the labile carbon that bounces around the most. So if we think about our char, as I said, this is accumulated, I'm not talking about biochar here, we can talk about that later perhaps. This is looking at char that's naturally within our soil and doesn't really change. It might be eroded and physically removed from the site, but in terms of being stable, it's quite inert and stable in our soil. If we've had a management practice change, which I'm suggesting in this conceptual example, you might get an increase in humus over time. So we can see it builds really, really slowly, but it can increase with time and with microbial activity in particular, and nutrient supply. Now, what we're looking at for this third fraction, that bouncing around, most of that variability happens in that particular organic carbon fraction. And this is where with trading, they've kind of gone back and forth about which fraction should we actually be monitoring. For production, the cash is in the particular organic carbon because that's where the energy and the nutrient supply comes from. That's where the microbes are really active. Humus is the product of that. So as microbial activity increases, you'll get an increase in humus, but it's very, very slow and it's very, very hard to detect. But there is immense values in monitoring fractions. So if you were going to look at your total organic carbon and your particular organic carbon, you might actually pick up in some of that variability that we get with time. So now let's think about some of the management strategies that do increase soil carbon. When I introduced this yesterday, I said how my colleagues who are extension specialists, who some of you may know, say this is a nightmare of a table, but I absolutely love it because it does show you that you can increase soil carbon. And the amount of times I've been sitting in presentations and people say it's too hard or it's not possible or if it's this and that. We've got lots of published peer-reviewed literature where we do have sequestration rates which have been reported, and there's so much that hasn't been reported, but it does depend on seasonal rainfall, on climate, and on soil type. Now in this table before the big reveal, you'll see that I'm going to have a range of management factors. Then we're going to talk about the carbon sequestration rate. So this is looking at the tons of carbon per hectare to 30 centimetres. The years over which the trial was run and the reference, which I can provide for people later. Now, the reason it's important to think about the years over which the trial was run is that the carbon sequestration rate generally looks at carbon stocks at the start of a trial before you change anything, and then the change in carbon stocks over time. But if we just think, okay, carbon stocks at the start, this is where we ended 10 years later, you divide that difference in soil carbon stocks by the amount of years over which that occurred, and that's your carbon sequestration rate per hectare per year, remembering that it would bounce around. Now, when you change management practice, most of your change in soil carbon sequestration happens in the first 5 to 10 years, and then it plateaus out until you get another disturbance in the system, and then you might get another little kick up and another little disturbance and kick up. So if we've got a trial that's only run for 5 years and we're talking about 2.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare, you wouldn't necessarily expect that to be maintained for the next 5 to 10 or 20 years. Okay, so big reveal. These are the types of practices that we're going to talk about for pastures to begin with. So for perennial pastures, looking at liming, the role of perennial pastures in rotation, nutrient management, so making sure that you've got adequate pasture nutrition so that you can grow more biomass to store more carbon, and then different types of grazing management. And there's a whole heap of labels that we could get kind of tied up with talking about this. But in terms of looking at making sure that pastures are grazed so that you've got actively growing pastures for a greater period of the year. And then things like there was a meta-analysis which we'll talk about some of those rates for things like irrigation and introduced perennial pastures as well. What we can see straight away looking at down this list is there's no spooky science here. It's looking about, like a lot of the trials have just looked at overcoming soil constraints to production. So making sure that you're maximizing biomass supply. So when we look at our rates here, generally they've ranged from 0.1 tonne per hectare per year up to 1.5 tonnes per hectare per year. Remember, I said the key is to look at the years over which the trial was run. So if we look at the liming trial, which Yin and Mark Conyers ran down around Wagga, that went for 18 years. And they managed to maintain over that trial about 0.5 tonne per hectare per year, which is still a significant amount of carbon, a significant sequestration rate for an environment like Wagga. So some of the grazing management that we're looking at there, so that 0.3 tonnes from Yin's work, that was in the tablelands environments. For those of you who are from the central tablelands and around the Hunter, that would be the case as well. The strategic and rotational grazing management, some of my work that's been done down on the Monero with 5-year actually kind of penned trials with livestock through to some of the rangelands work where we've looked at monitoring sites over now for over 10 years, and we've managed to identify almost 1.5 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year in the low rainfall zone. So it is possible, right? Now, would this be possible across the whole landscape? No, because what you need to do is identify responsive zones. And we'll talk about some of those other limitations in a minute, but thinking about the right practice at the right time in the right place is key here. Now if we just move on to looking at some cropping systems, and a lot of my examples revolve around the role of pastures in mixed farming systems or pastures in rotation, because that's the easiest way to build up soil organic carbon and to maintain that biological activity, because it gives diversity in carbon input, it enhances soil structure and aeration. But we're looking at from here, there's been some recent work which we've just published and should be out in the next week or so, where we've looked at converting degraded cropping paddocks. So the key there is degraded. So we're starting from a low level already of soil organic carbon to permanent pasture with adequate nutrition. And that nutrition doesn't matter if it comes from a bag, from fertilizer, or an organic amendment. So just making sure that the pastures and microbes have the nutrients that they need to grow. When we've looked at some of our trials, which I thought last night, I probably should have included it for today as well, where we've looked at stubble retention and just moving to direct drill, so looking at minimum till systems, what we've often seen in our replicated trials is that you reduce the loss of carbon, but you don't rapidly increase soil carbon sequestration. You need something else in the system. So you're going, right, we're not going to decline carbon anymore, but what are you going to do? And then you need to think about the role of organic amendments or nutrient management or a biological product, for example, just to kickstart that system again. So here again, though, these are a lot of this is looking at that conversion of cropping paddocks to pasture, but also where we've looked at managing the pasture rotation in cropping systems. Again, this is a lot of work in southern New South Wales, where we're looking at about 1/4 tonne per hectare per year in including a pasture phase in rotation. Now, some of these might only be 2-year pasture phases and up to 6-year pasture phases in those trials. Clive Kirkby's work, which is the bottom example there, where he's reported or published over 1 tonne per hectare per year in cropping systems where you're incorporating stubble with nutrients. That occurred over 1.6 metres, so that was like, so you've kind of, that's a greater depth over which that change is occurring. And again, that was a short-term reporting period, so that might plateau off. But again, that just shows about the importance of nutrient provision for microbes to decompose organic matter and stubble. But then there's lots of examples where despite best management, soil organic carbon doesn't increase. And these pictures here on the screen break my heart because it was one of my first studies where I ever looked at the role of cell grazing in the Western Division. The left-hand picture was a continuously grazed pasture. There's not much pasture left yet. And the right-hand side was a cell grazed pasture, which had been cell grazed. We looked at it for over 8 years. And if you look at that just by eyeballing, you'd say, yeah, there's probably going to be more carbon under the place where plants are growing compared to the place where plants aren't. But there was no significant difference in soil organic carbon contents in that comparison. But if you have a look at it, there's a whole heap of other benefits that are occurring there in terms of ground cover, in terms of feed availability, perenniality in that system, and microbial activity. So what are some of the reasons? Well, as I've already said, it's really important that you're comparing apples with apples, and soil type and climate can have a major influence on carbon sequestration rates through their impact on productivity and primary productivity and decomposition. Poor crop and pasture nutrition is often a cause for little difference in carbon sequestration rates. And that's in particular where I've looked at and some of my own survey work, looking at the role of grazing management in increasing soil organic carbon concentration. And I walked down the silly path myself of going, right, well, if we've got rotationally grazed pastures and continuously grazed pastures, of course, pastures which have actively growing plants for a greater period of time going to have more carbon, but you need to make sure those plants also have nutrients, and it can be nutrients which can limit carbon sequestration as well. We've already spoken about the kind of bouncing around that can happen with dry seasons or prolonged periods of dry with droughts. There's a huge amount of spatial variability, which makes soil science exciting, but also makes looking at things like this highly complicated. So you need to make sure that your sampling strategy and design is going to be able to cope with variability in soil properties and soil carbon as well. And then sometimes it might be that you've already got a really large background level of soil organic carbon, so it's really challenging to demonstrate or statistically prove these incremental changes. And the example that I like to use with this is, imagine if I've got 2 buckets exactly the same size in front of me, okay? And at this stage, they're both empty. You can see that they're both empty. I take one of those buckets and I fill it up with sand. Now, if I get you to look into those 2 buckets, you go, yep, one's full of sand, one's empty. Now, if I come along with 1 cup of sand, okay? Now, if I poured that 1 cup of sand into the bucket that's already full of sand, you couldn't tell, could you? Nope, you wouldn't know. If I poured that cup of sand into the empty bucket, you'd be able to look in and see it. It was the same amount of sand, okay? But you can see it in an empty bucket, but you can't see it in a bucket that's already full. And that's the same. So when we talk about carbon sequestration rates, it might be the same rate of sequestration, but if you've already got a large background level, it can be really challenging to detect that. And this is often what we find where people already have perennial pastures in place with a high nutrition, and they're bang on with their grazing management. And we come in and we look at baselining now and looking at increases into the future, and it's really hard to detect an increase in a short amount of time. And then sometimes, and this breaks my heart to say, maybe soil organic carbon just isn't the best metric to demonstrate the benefits of management. It's certainly a really important one, but in that heartbreaking image at the top where you've got the left-hand side, which is clearly overgrazed compared to the right-hand side, soil organic carbon, if I had have just used that, was not the best metric to demonstrate the importance of rotational grazing, providing ground cover. So if we just very briefly talk about the role of pastures, as I've said, in cropping systems, the low-hanging fruit is nutrition and pasture phases for increasing soil organic carbon. And pasture phases, their length and the type of pasture that's sown can influence, I guess, soil carbon sequestration rates or mitigate the decline in soil organic carbon. With a pasture phase, we have a build-up in soil organic matter, and with that, carbon and nitrogen. And then what's typically happened, and where the pasture phases developed over decades and decades, was you'd build up nitrogen in your pasture phase, and then you use that organic nitrogen, that biologically fixed nitrogen, in your cropping phase, and you'd get a decline in carbon. Then you'd go back into your pasture phase, and you'd increase it again. So you have this kind of bouncing around. So what can we do here if we were going to try and increase soil carbon as well as get that biological supply of nitrogen? So let's think about it. The benefits of pasture rotations are sacred. They are exceptionally important for improving soil structure, for supporting microbial diversity and life within the soil, for fixing nitrogen, and for building up soil organic matter. We know that they can also sequester carbon through that accumulation of organic matter. But we also know that good crops need lots of nitrogen, and those crops are going to get nitrogen from that organic matter pool, as well as any fertilizer that we might add. So it's this inevitable consequence that we know that soil nitrogen is going to mineralize from that organic matter pool. When we talk about that mineralization, it comes down to the nutrient relationship in organic matter. And microbes need to decompose organic matter to make nitrogen available, and to do that for the following crops, which is agronomically desirable. The byproduct of that is respiration. So we have a carbon loss from the system there. So it's really challenging to have high rates of sequestration with pasture phases and cheap nitrogen. So what am I saying? You need to either alter the length of the pasture phase, the composition of the pasture phase, and or apply nitrogen when you go back into the crop if you want to build soil organic carbon as well. Right, so what are some of our management strategies to build soil organic carbon? Now, in isolation, some of these strategies perhaps won't build soil organic carbon, they'll just reduce the loss of carbon, but certainly some of these are very important in cropping and pasture systems for rapidly increasing soil organic carbon. I've just spoken about the importance of the pasture phase. So changing the crop to pasture sequence can increase soil organic carbon composition. It can also increase productivity in the cropping phase through that role of biological health that kind of builds up in soil structure. Introducing cover crops. And with a lot of these strategies that I'm talking about in this slide here, there might be some short-term yield penalties in changing practice, but then there can be long-term soil health and productivity benefits as well. So cover crops is going to be have to be decided on a site-by-site or region-by-region basis. It doesn't always work because sometimes there's just too much competition for soil moisture when you go back into the crop phase. There's a lot of exciting research being done on multi-species pastures in the States and in Australia now, and I think that's going to be a great opportunity for building soil organic carbon and oversowing pastures as well. Managing nutrient inputs to optimize plant growth as well as nutrient microbial activity and decomposition. So not only do our plants need nutrients, but our microbes need nutrients as well. As I said, I'm not just talking about nutrients from a bag. Often, I think when this work first kind of was a bit of a headline, it was talked about the nutrient value that you need to kind of pay to get your microbes kicking. But a lot of these nutrients can come from organic sources as well, so manures and litters and composts, and they're really important, I guess, for starting those biological processes in the soil and building humus. Overcoming soil constraints such as acidity and sidicity through the use of lime and gypsum are a way to increase biomass production, so organic matter supply to the soil. Minimizing tillage, but in some cases considering strategic tillage. So some of Mark Conya's work of late has shown that occasional tillage to overcome a soil constraint, be that a physical constraint or a biological constraint in terms of like a pathogen or a weed, can actually increase soil carbon. So it doesn't necessarily have to have a net decrease effect. Retaining stubble, not only for the organic matter part of it, but really importantly for the surface soil protection from erosion, and the buffering that it has with soil temperature and reducing evaporation loss as well, which is important for our microbial health. Identifying degraded soils, or identifying parts which are responsive soils and targeting those. I think, like, as I've said before, it's not about thinking about the landscape and it's just the same sequestration rate, I guess, for everywhere. It's about identifying those parts of the farming landscape where you can have maximum increases in soil organic carbon sequestration. Or it's just about kind of identifying where you want to make those transformational changes and taking it one step at a time. And adding carbon-rich materials. So things like compost, biosolids and manures to the soil as amendments, as priming for soil organisms, but also as a carbon source. So in summary, and I've got 2 slides on another one, just if we want to talk about soil carbon trading, but just to summarize this part of the talk. So carbon cycling on our farms already. And I guess to change it and to sequester more carbon, you might need to change practice. So it's not just about having a system that's highly functioning. Sometimes you'll actually need a disturbance in that system to increase soil carbon sequestration. And then it comes to thinking about what's your biggest lever. So what can you actually change to get the biggest impact in organic matter supply to the soil? And that might be overcoming a soil constraint. It might be about soil nutrition, or it might be another constraint. It might be a constraint in, I guess, decision making sometimes as well. Remember, really importantly, that there's soil and climate factors that limit carbon sequestration potential. So when we're thinking about comparing sites between regions, we've got to be really careful. And within regions, we need to be thinking about the influence of soil type on sequestration rates. The benefits of soil organic matter to soil fertility are from that nutrient cycling. So where I spoke before about the functional carbon, it's not just about continuously accumulating carbon, it's thinking about whether or not your soils are cycling nutrients. So about the microbial activity within the soils, because that's where the value in increasing soil organic matter is. And to increase soil organic carbon, you need to consider, as I said, it's about matching the right practice in the right place at the right time. So I did have, if you'd like, I have 2 slides on soil carbon trading, because someone, I think Anne mentioned, would you like me to just talk about soil carbon trading for a second?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I can't see anyone, so I'm just like assuming people are still there. It'd be such a shame if everyone had gone. Okay. All right. So, okay. So in Australia, you can trade soil carbon on like both. Okay. In Australia, you can trade soil carbon. At the last auction, soil carbon sold for, or carbon sold for about $14 a tonne of carbon dioxide equivalents. This has been an increase from when the market first came online a few years ago, from $10 a tonne. In Europe, I think the price is around $40 a tonne. So in Australia, the market is quite small and restricted by price at the moment. But remember, this is carbon dioxide equivalents. So when we're talking about, say, $14 a tonne or $13.87, we multiply that by 3.66 if we're looking at how much that is per tonne of soil carbon. Okay, all of a sudden, so I generally say, in southern New South Wales, with improved land management practice, with changed land management and overcoming soil constraints to productivity, you can probably sequester half a tonne per hectare per year. And at rates at prices like $50 per tonne of soil carbon, that makes it quite attractive. So in Australia, there's, for agriculture, there's over 18 million tonnes of abatement contracted so far. Some of that is, I mean, most of that is in soil carbon. There's a huge amount in vegetation carbon in the Western Division as well. But with the Australian government, they've kind of now got the Climate Solutions Fund. So there's additional money that's been put into purchasing carbon from all industries. Now, the total investment sits at over $4.5 billion. It's important to remember though, your story doesn't really matter when you're selling carbon on this market. And the reason I like to highlight that is because I think consumers in the end will start buying the story and the narrative around why increasing soil carbon is important. So all the things that go on with that in terms of improved soil resource condition. And that's where we've got these emerging markets coming online for green premiums and ecosystem services. To sell carbon, you need to acquire an ACCU, an Australian Carbon Credit Unit. So you can sell these ACCUs to the government, and that's that price that I spoke about before, around that $14 a tonne. But we've also got a voluntary market in Australia as well. And generally, the price on the voluntary market is higher. So why is it higher? Because people are buying part of the story. So this is where industries are going, okay, I'm a big airline company and I need to offset my emissions because I know people are looking now at what we're doing, whether or not that is acceptable. I could buy credits off the government, or I could buy it off an aggregator where I can sell some of that story, and I can tell them that my carbon credits are coming from trees that are planted in this area and soil in this area that's being farmed this way. So the voluntary market is quite attractive for people who don't have to decrease carbon emissions, but it's good industry or business practice to decrease carbon emissions. So the ACCUs need to be, but regardless if it's on the voluntary market or the Australian government market, you've got to get an ACCU, so you can't sell it otherwise. And it needs to be consistent with approved methodologies, and these methodologies are regulated to the Australian government. So in the next couple of months, we're going to see massive changes in this space because they're revising all the soil carbon methods. And the reason that this is exciting is that they're making it easier for farmers and aggregators to form partnerships in this space to increase soil carbon. At the moment, there's two soil carbon methods. One is a measurement-based method, so where you take a baseline measurement, very complicated and quite expensive, and then you demonstrate, and then you implement your practice change, and then they come back 5 years later and measure the change in soil carbon, and then they do that again at regular intervals. And you get paid on the increase in soil carbon. But when they're selling those credits, they might give you an indication as a producer about how much they think based on literature and models. Now, the models greatly underestimate soil carbon sequestration rates at the moment in a lot of regions. So where we've looked at sequestration rates of say 1/2 tonne up to 1.5 tonnes in our recent study, which is coming out this month, the models are looking at only about say 0.2 of a tonne. So they're quite conservative. The other method, so that's the measurement-based method. The other method is using default values. So this is where they say, okay, you're in this region with this soil type under this climate, and you're now going to change from a crop to a pasture, or with your pasture, now you're going to apply nutrients and you're going to graze it so that you're maintaining maximum ground cover for most of the year. And then they'll give you a value and you'll kind of sell that value. As I said, it's quite conservative though. So there are approved strategies or practices that are on that kind of positive list, and they're all things around overcoming soil constraints, grazing management practice, use of compost is on there, biochar is on the positive list, so there's some, and the role of legumes as well is in there as well. Now, any carbon that you get paid for needs to be additional. So it needs to be an increase. If you've got really high carbon levels already, you can't get paid for that. It's only the sequestration that occurs after the contracting begins. And so this automatically kind of rules out a lot of people perhaps who have already implemented best prac. It needs to be new, so not your business as usual. And it also needs to be permanent. So that means that it gets tied to the title for 25 or 100 years, depending which contract you sign. crash course in carbon trading.
Excellent. Thanks, Suze. That was an interesting little addition there. So yeah, greatly appreciated though. And you had the question about cultivation. Did Suze cover that enough for you?
Well, I suppose in terms of if you assume that soil is going to be eroded either through wind or water erosion, then that's going to be the default there under erosion. But then Sue said that, you know, sometimes you can use that as a disturbance mechanism to kickstart the system as well. So it's, once again, it's about timing and trying to work out, you know, what that actual timing is to get the best benefit.
Yep, and I completely recognise that for some people who have committed to no-till, that's never going to be an option, and that's fine as well. But it's certainly a tool at the right time which can, I guess, increase or overcome a constraint, increase productivity or overcome a constraint. And it's about what you do after that.
Yeah, so here's a question for you. So if you have been practicing no-till, zero-till for many years, stubble retention, so it's just fully sprayed, no cultivation, what are the indicators then for considering cultivation in that system? Obviously, if there's massive weeds like fleabane or something and you can't control it any other way with, you know, your double knock systems or whatever that might be, is that a trigger, or what other triggers would there be?
Soil pathogens might be a trigger, herbicide resistance might be a trigger. If you're kind of getting a dense, speaking to someone late last year about a dense root mat, they just weren't getting any kind of penetration. They just had these dense root mat, and we're kind of talking about biological things that you could do or increase, but really just ripping it and then starting again would be a good way just to break up that impenetrable layer of root mass. And that was just perhaps anyway, story.
If you identify what the constraint might be, and I suppose so, yes, if there's a compaction layer at 20 or 30 centimeters that you think, well, I know the soil below that is good, and I know that there's moisture and nutrients down there, so if I just do a strategic rip to break that compaction layer, so at least I can give the roots a chance to get down into good soil. I mean, you need to determine that there's no constraints below that compaction.
That's right. Yeah. So, it's thinking about the soil.
It becomes a timing. So in a heavier clays, then it becomes a timing issue with, you know, with moisture, you know, how moist they are, whether they're dry when you go to do it. But further to that, my understanding is that with our synthetic fertilizer applications, your NPKs, that we're making our microbes lazy, because we haven't got the diversity of microbes that are going to actually make up the benefits, the total greater benefits that we need for soil health. So they're just ticking along rather than actually really expanding the soil's ability at depth to really help with carbon and carbon sequestration.
Yeah, I think there's certainly, I mean, there's been a lot of work in the past. There's an increased focus on that now, I think, with regenerative ag, and I think it's a good focus, right? Like, it's very easy just to keep thinking that we can just keep pouring on nutrients and growing more crops, but we're seeing, I guess, decreasing yields with the same amount of nutrients. So it's important to think about things differently. Certainly, the more available nutrients you've got, so if you've got a lot of nitrogen in the system, you're going to have a decrease in your root nodulation with your legumes and your rhizobia, for example. And we know, because if the plant doesn't need nitrogen, why on earth would it spend energy and carbohydrates on making those associations? And there's similar examples documented for available phosphorus and mycorrhizal fungi. I think where we need to be really careful, though, is just thinking about going cold turkey on some of those nutrients and then expecting to maintain the same levels of yield or productivity in the short term. I think there's always going to be that transition period, and then it's going to come to down to economics. Perhaps your yields will decrease or not be as much as they were, but if your costs have decreased as well, then I mean, your profitability can be maintained or increased.
Well, you can't go cold turkey because you haven't got those other microbes there to actually support the system to keep it functioning if you take it all out. So the transition is really, really important.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I heard a fantastic presentation. I just can't think of, I was a farmer from the Birchup group, and he was saying that he went cold turkey. He was there to give a regen ag talk, and he's like, I love my farming system now, and we've got there in the end 10 years later. Would never advise for anyone to get there the path I walked, because it was not a clever way to do it. But he kind of spoke about that kind of, I guess, paring back. But I think the biggest gains to be made are just by looking at nutrient use efficiency. So regardless of whatever we're doing, just making sure that we're being strategic with our application of nutrients anyway, which is good farming practice. So
Thanks, Suze. And Lucas has made some comments in the chat, so have a look at those. Tim, would you like to ask your question about the amount of nutrients per 1% increase?
Yeah, I was just interested, Suze, in when you talked about how a 1% increase in soil organic carbon can equate to a 1 tonne increase in nitrogen, phosphorus, and other ones. Is that how did I structure this before? Is that like just because? So where has that nitrogen come from specifically? Is that just from you increasing the biomass and that turning into soil organic carbon eventually? Like, have you sourced, like, provided that initial nitrogen and that's just stored within the soil organic matter?
Yep.
So initially you have to put that up there to get that in the soil.
That's right. Yep. And that's why that'll be faster. In those systems, it's going to be faster where you've got a legume, for example, or if you've got lots of free living nitrogen fixing bacteria, because nitrogen is the next one down in terms of the most important nutrient in that soil organic matter matrix as well. Those ratios, though, come from, I guess, the buildup of humus, so the buildup of bacteria and fungal activity within the soil. So they're really there, and they're very clever at sourcing and using nutrients, not only from organic matter where the plants are readily accessing and turning over, but from deeper in the soil as well.
Oh, okay, right. Yeah, because I was reading that article the other day, and it's come up a little bit lately in regards to like this kind of topic, and it's like, have you read like Fiona's Leach's study? Yeah, well, I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that particular one, where she's compared alternative fertilizers in pasture production and microbial structure.
So it's like, it's great because it's a landmark study, and looking at commercially available products and their impact on both productivity and microbial communities is kind of almost unprecedented in the pasture space in this area anyway. I don't know what else to say. Sorry, what was the question?
Because like it was interesting talking to some growers who've read it, and some of them are in the regenerative space and are trying to go cold turkey, as we discussed.
Yeah.
Well, the study kind of dictates that essentially it was the cheapest option was to add single super to the pasture mix to achieve, and there was no loss in microbial structure or even diversity, that they benefit just as well with the single super as opposed to a tea extract or something. That there was no difference. It was just cheaper and more economical to get the same result, but with single super.
Yeah, yep. And again, that just comes down to, I guess, good pasture agronomy. And I guess there was there was greater biomass with single super, and there was no detrimental effects reported on microbial community or structure. But I'm just trying to think of what happened in the control with that one. There was something interesting where even if you did nothing, there was still similar rates of biomass production compared to some of the biologicals, I think. I can't remember. I'm sorry. I don't know. Lucas, do you want to comment?
Yes, but I have read the paper, Suze, but I too have forgotten some of the key points.
Yeah.
But I think you summed it up, that there really was no major impact of the biological additives as far as microbial populations go. That was a key outcome.
And I think I think it was like it's a highly acidic soil as well. I kind of, yeah.
And that mirrors, you know, some of the classical work on soil biology from, you know, Martin Alexander back in the 1960s from the US. You know, and it was sort of back in that era that, you know, they were starting to look at inoculation of soils with specific microbes, and yeah, even back then they're stating that, you know, soils have got the microbes already there. You know, the majority of microbes that you need are already present. They've got a multitude of functions, and you've got significant functional redundancy, and that means that if one microbe stops doing what it does, there'll be another microbe that comes in and does that same function, you know, nitrification, for example, or breakdown of carbon. So it really, and I think it really comes down to what you're feeding the microbes, quality of the carbon source. And there's some great papers from you know, people like Yunyin Fang and BP Singh in DPI, showing that the quality of the carbon, and in particular quality relating to the carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, has got a very, very significant impact on the soil biology, but also your potential for storing carbon and that sort of carbon cycle. And it all comes down to, you know, the work from Clive Kirkby, I think, that Sue's mentioned, and the point that Sue's made. Yeah, to store carbon, you need nitrogen, you need phosphorus, and you've got to lock it up. And the best way to get that is with a high quality input through legumes, most likely.
I do think as well what's been overlooked in some of the studies is the role of grazing animals as well. And so we can have plants and soil, and it's good because soils, people are thinking about plants in the system. That's really, we've overcome that barrier. But we're still kind of missing the role of livestock and livestock grazing. So when we're looking at livestock and how close they graze to so not only just their trampling impact and their manure and that kind of recycling of it, but the impact of plant sloughing, root sloughing, sorry, following grazing pressure and grazing pulling on roots as well, and what that does for those signals. I think, so Fiona didn't, and you couldn't, like, it's a night. I've only ever done one grazing management study where we've actually kept animals in and looked after them, and it was just a nightmare. But I think there's a lot more work to be done, and this is perhaps in that regen ag space there's going to be some really important innovations on the role of livestock in changing root exudates and microbial activity that way. Like, Lucas, I don't know if you want to comment, but I think that's a really exciting space, and it's really challenging to have.
You made the point. I think there's a lot of researchers and practitioners, you know, know that animals have got a really important spot in the landscape, but actually quantifying the benefit, I think, is far more challenging than than most of us would appreciate. Because, you know, animals concentrate their manures, concentrate their urine. You get this massive variability within trial patches. So it is a challenging task to do that in a proper grazing system.
Yeah,
it's a lot easier in a simulated system where you cut the pasture and you take it away, but it's not the same.
That's right, because you don't have the animal saliva and you don't have the tugging on the plants when they're grazing. And if you kind of listen to a lot of people, that could be really important.
So the good news here is that Kel is, I think, managing or about to start managing a trial that will actually start incorporating livestock into the system on a farmer property. So, you know, Terry Rose and myself are coming in sort of at the back end to help Kel and his team, and Nathan Jennings to understand some of the roles of cattle in the system with the rotational and grazing system, and I guess nutrient budgeting on soil organic carbon fractions and soil functions. So looking at nitrogen turnover, phosphorus turnover, sulfur turnover, and maybe some higher end microbial diversity measures as well. Excellent.
Kel, it looks like you've got a couple of extra things to pop on your monitoring list there.
Yeah, Lucas is right. It's been a late addition to the project, and it is really valuable to have Terry and DPI being able to help us maybe tie some of that stuff together, because we have looked at it in a reasonably practical sense in terms of what other grazing beef farmers in the area will get from looking at the demonstration. So being able to underpin it with some of the data is going to be really, really useful to say, well, this is what they did on the surface. This is what's happening with the pastures, and this is what's happening with the soils. And we can monitor grazing days and grazing density and all of that sort of stuff, and then try and tie it all together. That's kind of the plan. Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
I think, yeah, what I found really challenging with our Monero study is dealing with grazing behaviour. So for example, we had grazing, we had cells, and we had rotationally grazed or strategically grazed areas, and then we had continuously grazed. And obviously animals don't want to graze up against fence lines, and that's kind of where, so it was a nightmare for a soil scientist and an agronomist and one livestock person to try and replicate over 5 years a grazing management trial and come up, like, it was just, I think we set ourselves up to fail. And we found some interesting reports, but I think we were almost, and not saying that you guys are going to be like this, because it sounds like you've got farmers in the system. We're kind of dealing with livestock in the system, and I think farmers in the system are really important as well, because so much of it was about when we moved them and why we moved them, and grazing animal behavior, which we just weren't.
Yeah, no, it's probably not even a consideration. We're just saying, if this is our 20 cells, and this is trying to treat it as a real world farm as possible. So if John, the farmer, wants to move them from cell A to cell B because he thought this was the right thing to do, well, you just do it as you want to do it, and we'll see how that all comes out the other end. So at the end of the day, hopefully we can say, John did it this way, and this is what we found. It may not necessarily be the right way, but, you know, the mix of pastures, and then if you wanted opportunity crop a section, well, we can do that too. We just try and measure all of that and say, at the end of the day, this is the methodology and the farm practice that was in place. This is the impacts on soil and pastures and economics and animal performance as well. So
one of the challenging aspects of that particular type of trial too is, when do you actually sample? So do you sample at a set point after it's been grazed, or do you sample the whole site? And if you sample at a set time after grazing, then you've got climatic variables. So it might rain between, you know, cell graze 18 to cell graze 20. So there's a whole heap of technical questions in there that we still need to try and work out what are the pros and cons of, you know, a fixed sampling time versus a dynamic sampling time. And you can't do everything.
No,
so, yeah.
That's right too. So yeah, some challenges, but we'll just see how we go as we go along. That's where we've got Nathan and Lucas and Terry to do some of that hard thinking.
Well done. Good idea. Any other questions from anybody else? I'd like to open the floor, invite you to unmute yourself and ask a question while we've got Suze on the line.
Suze, I've got another question. So again, it goes back to that stoichiometric ratio of soil organic carbon. I think we've got a reasonable understanding of the nitrogen, or starting to get a reasonable understanding of the nitrogen, but some of the other elements and micro elements, you know, although Clive and some of his papers have mentioned them, how strong an understanding do we really have around, you know, phosphorus and potassium and micronutrients in those ratios of soil organic matter?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have quite a poor understanding about how sensitive they are. And I think the challenge is going to be that we often think about soils in, like, you know, just as this kind of one chunk, whereas everything is more concentrated in the surface soil layer. But when we're talking about things like phosphorus and sulfur, there's a lot that influence the acquisition of those nutrients deeper down in the profile. And so while the nutrient ratios in the humus might be reasonably set for that humic pool, I guess where they're actually being acquired from and what we can influence with surface soil management is going to be challenging to understand. A lot more work to be done. We're doing a lot of work at the moment as well. I mean, Clive didn't really touch on potassium And I think that that's a really important one as well. And potassium in the soil, just in general, I think has been quite underdone, like in terms of its role in drought resistance and tolerance, and the way that plants use that will be becoming increasingly important. But yeah, there's still lots of exciting work, I guess, to be done at that nutrient relationship point. I still think the biggest innovations and gains are going to be made with innovation in the field, to be honest. Like, you know, there's a whole lot of products and things that you can squirt wherever, but I think in terms of those big gains, we still need to think about the innovation will be in the way we use and assemble the tools that we've already got, rather than an innovative new tool for soil carbon at the landscape level. Not saying that the kind of exciting kind of squirting stuff isn't fun and exciting too.
Thanks, Suze. Excellent.
All right.
I'm conscious that we've hit gone a little bit over time, so I don't want to keep you any longer than what we've scheduled to. So I'll wrap it up and just say thank you very much, Suze. You've done another awesome job of giving us a good rundown on soil organic carbon and measuring and monitoring and how we might be able to influence it. So I really appreciate your time and effort that you've spent with the group today.
Thanks for the invite, and lovely to meet you all and see some of you again. So been good. Thanks for inviting me along.
No worries at all. It's been our pleasure.
Bye.
See you, folks. Thank you.